We are asked to agree to things which we cannot believe. Douglas Murray, author of The Madness of Crowds, on Uncommon Knowledge now. Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Associate editor of the London Spectator, Douglas Murray is the author of a number of books, including The Strange Death of Europe, which appeared in 2017. His most recent book, published last year, The Madness of Crowds, Gender, Race, and Identity. Douglas, welcome. Let me read you two quotations. One is from The Madness of Crowds, and another I'll come to in a moment. It's a quotation that came to my mind when I was reading The Madness of Crowds. And then you tell me whether I'm being tendentious by putting these two quotations together or whether in one way or another they fit. Here's the first quotation, and it's you, The Madness of Crowds. While the endless contradictions, fabrications, and fantasies within identity politics are visible to all, identifying them is not just discouraged, but literally policed. And so we are asked to agree to things which we cannot believe, close quote. Now here's the second quotation, and this comes from Natan Sharansky, now a prominent parliamentarian in Israel, but a refusenik in the old Soviet Union who did time in prison. This is Natan Sharansky, quote, "I was a loyal Soviet citizen until the age of 20. What it meant to be a loyal Soviet citizen was to say what you were supposed to say, to read what you were permitted to read, to vote the way you were told to vote, and at the same time, to know that it was all a lie."
Yes, yes. I've had the privilege of meeting Sharansky a couple of times. He's a great moral hero of mine. Yes, there is something in this. I have, like all of us, spent a certain amount of time in recent years thinking about totalitarianism and of particularly the evils of communist totalitarianism and the way in which lies were expected of the citizenry and why that was. And I think it was Solzhenitsyn who I first became aware of this through, but other writers have written about it. Anthony Daniels, the British writer who writes under the name Theodore Dalrymple, as you know, also identified this in his book On the Wilder Shores of Marx in 1989. He said he often wondered why it was that the communist systems demanded that people said things and agreed to things which they knew weren't true. And he came to the conclusion, as Sharansky, as Solzhenitsyn and others did, that it was precisely that this was the way to demoralize people.
Yes.
Now, I believe that there is no grand plot, but that the people at the moment who have been trying to make everybody agree to these ridiculous claims, just shut up and say trans women are women and there's no difference. Just shut up and say all of these things. In the case of America at the moment, just stick the "Don't Hurt Me" BLM sign in your window and make the crowd and mob pass. All of these things are designed to demoralize people at some level, that you're meant to just go along with it because it will make you a more cringing and therefore more pliable human being for whatever is to come next. And that's why I think now, as at every other point in history, it's the duty of anyone who thinks for themselves and can speak up to say, no, I'm not agreeing to whatever you make me say today. I'm my own person. I will not imbibe lies and I will not spew them out either. And that's why I encourage as many people as possible to do that. But we undoubtedly, in the modern West, live in countries now where we are asked to imbibe and spew lies if we work for governmental organizations, for non-governmental organizations, increasingly for what used to be serious corporate entities, and almost every sector of public-private life. And I think this is sinister. I think it should be stopped now. And I'd like to see other people increasingly start to do so.
So, Douglas, The Madness of Crowds came out, something like 18 months ago. We were hoping to get together long before this, but in any event, so it's been out for a while.
The updated edition has only come out in the last month. I wanted to try to give answers that were deep, general and did not require, as it were, a PhD in intersectionality to address. Because it's my belief that, and it's why I wrote the book really, I want people to get round it, out of it, over it, through it as fast as possible. I don't want us caught on this crap. I don't want us stuck on it. And it's my belief that if we can identify the fundamental errors and indeed injustices in this system, it's better than, for instance, having the best possible shoot down quote of Kimberly Crenshaw or Peggy McIntosh to apply to this, because then we're going to spend all our time talking about this, and we're not going to read we're not going to read Sharansky or Solzhenitsyn, we're not going to read any of the classics. We're going to spend all of our time trying to read different papers associated with this gunk, and we're not going to get on with our lives. The reason I address these at the very basic level, like, what's the place for forgiveness in this? Or just ask what they're comparing it to, is because I think these are shortcuts. I think these and the other things I suggest are just shortcuts for people, particularly young people, to know that they've got a way through when this stuff comes at them. I want, when somebody is in their office and they're told that they're going to have a race awareness training thing, and the white people are all going to be told how awful they are, I want them not to have to argue back on racial grounds. I don't want them to have to imbibe all of the unreadable, if very well selling books of the current race hucksters. Right. But I do want them to know what sort of thing they can say to the people telling them to educate themselves, who are always and everywhere less educated than the people they're telling that to.
All right, this brings us to your 5 weeks in this country. Can I? All right, and the unavoidable topic here is Donald J. Trump, who has faults, you may have noticed. To what extent, and yet here he ended up getting something like 9 million more votes this time around than he got 4 years ago. To what extent is the phenomenon of Donald Trump and the notion that for all his faults of comportment, and I won't list them, 48% of the country voted for him. To what extent did they do so because he's talking back to this stuff? People look at him, they understand there's something in the discourse now that's poisonous, and after them. And one way or another, you look across the landscape of political figures, Republican and Democratic, and you say, wait a minute, that man is talking back. At least he's doing that. Does that strike you as, in other words, has your argument in one way or another worked its way right into the center of American politics?
I think so, because I agree. This is obviously one of the things underlying this. The classic example to give is you're an unemployed steelworker somewhere in the center of America, and then on top of everything else, you've got to be told every day in the media that you've got white privilege.
Right, right.
Really? You have a child with a woman, you separate, she gets most access to the child, and you get to see your child every other weekend, say, for half an hour, and you're told you've got male privilege. Like, there's a lot of unpleasantness that's been allowed to run on unaddressed in recent years, and a lot of unforgivingness that has been allowed to run against people because of characteristics over which they have no say. And we would have called this out a long time ago if the victims had been gay, right, if the victims had been women, if the victims had been black or only black. And instead, we have this note of vengeance that I think a lot of people have picked up on. And I think it's I think it's definitely one of the things that propelled Donald Trump. He would, of course, some people say, and this is a perfectly good argument, historians will of course argue over this, that in some ways Donald Trump made all of this worse, because once his opponents realized that he was opposed to that, they doubled down and made even more crazy claims simply in order to enrage Trump and his supporters. There might be something in that. But, you know, in America, it's not like the race issue has got better in the last 10 years. The polls I cite in the Mansour crowd show the number of Americans who think that race relations are worse now. And that it's always got to be remembered, was happening in the Obama years as well. You know, Black Lives Matter began when President Obama was in office. They were getting away with making their claims about America when Obama was in office. They've been able to double down them and make much crazier claims since Trump's been in office. But yes, this is, by the way, there's a specific set of American culture wars which have sadly spilt out and polluted the whole Western world. It's a shame to me, because I admire America for all sorts of reasons and have always loved it. But on this, you've exported some of your worst viruses and made them go global. And in particular, I'm thinking of the American race problem, the interpretation of the American race problem, which obviously, you know, is now an interpretation which has been exported elsewhere, often to countries that simply don't have it. The famous example I always give is of the British, of Britain, which has had some of our own race problems, but we haven't had the dialogue and dialectic that's been going on in America until America imported it recently. I wrote a piece in the New York Post last month saying, thanks for that, America. That's one export we could have done without. There is something very interesting going on here. You see, one of the fears some of us have had on the right in recent years it might be boiled down to this. What if the Enlightenment didn't go as deep or as wide as we had hoped? What if the Enlightenment didn't go as deep or as wide as we'd hoped? Now, I'd say that America in particular in recent years has been a demonstration that that fear may be vindicated. Mm-hmm. But in France, the principles of the Enlightenment, and particularly of secularism, are very, very deeply dug. The left and the right are in agreement on them and will defend them. It's the American left that doesn't understand this. It's the elements of the British left that do not understand this. It's these people who think that an assertion of secularism that treats people exactly the same, whatever their religious background, is in some ways, to use one of the crock terms of the era, Islamophobic. So it's not the French that are at fault. I think that France is making an extraordinarily important defense of its values. And in doing so, it's actually defending one of the most important values of the whole of the West. I think there's something else as well here, which is that what has happened in France has been that there has been a unity caused by the opposition. And the opposition here, once again, to stress the point that Macron has made, we're not talking about all Muslims, but we are talking about the Islamists. The Islamists have been very, very assiduous in their choice of targets in recent years. And what we've seen in recent months is a replay of what we saw over the year of 2015. The year of 2015, you remember, begins with the massacre of the staff at Charlie Hebdo magazine, and it finishes with the massacre, the decapitation of a priest whilst he is saying mass at an altar of his church in Rouen. Now that is an attack on the total character, history, belief of the Republic. Yes. Everything. What we saw in November this year, was a very short replay of that. Starts with this 18-year-old Chechen going with a meat cleaver to decapitate a school teacher for teaching secular values to his students. And only a few weeks later, a man who had just recently arrived in September from Tunisia via the island of Lampedusa in Italy, which I reported from at the height of the crisis and said at the time, this is your soft underbelly, you've got to get this in order. They never did, they never bothered to properly sort it out, and they still haven't. But in late October, it's a young man who has just arrived through Lampedusa from Tunisia, who goes to the church in Nice, the Church of Notre Dame in Nice and decapitates and murders 3 worshippers as they're leaving church. So this is the same pattern. Everything from the secular value to the right to worship religiously and freely if you're a Christian in France. Now, I put it to you like this. If this had happened in America, you would have your idiots. Of course you would. But if your most prominent secularists and atheists in America were murdered 1 week, and then 2 weeks later there was a massacre of worshippers at the cathedral in Washington, or St. Patrick's or St. Thomas on Fifth Avenue, we might see some people in America wise up to this and realize that us in Europe, I say us wisely, those of us in Europe who have been raising alarms on this are not motivated by bigotry, but by a realistic estimation of a threat that we live with now daily. Nobody lives with it more than the French. And I think that it is absolutely despicable that an element of the radical American left who have made their way like a bacillus into the center of the news organizations of America are defaming the French Republic as a whole for having the right to object when everyone from their secularists to their worshippers at church are the target of the Islamists. So this is, as I say, an error of interpretation. The error is not the French Republic's. The French Republic deserves the solidarity and support of all people who believe in freedom.
Last question. And again, if I may, I'm going to pair 2 quotations. And again, the first is you, Douglas Murray in The Madness of Crowds. The agenda of identity politics is now going to be attempted to be rolled out across the Western world with unbelievable force, energy, and determination, and all in a spirit of exacting considerable vengeance, close quote. Here's the second quotation. And this is President Trump speaking in Warsaw in 2017. The defense of the West ultimately rests on the will of its people. The fundamental question of our time is whether the West has the will to survive. Do we have enough respect for our citizens to protect our borders? Do we have the desire and the courage to preserve our civilization in the face of those who will avert and destroy it? Close quote. You're charming and erudite and a little dark. Can you cheer us up in answering this last question? Can you give us grounds for optimism? Does the West, in the face of the threat from Islamicism and the madness we're suffering within, does the West have the will to survive?
Here's one way that I can answer that, which is that first of all, I think we should be very wary of looking for the perfect leader to lead us out of problems that we are in. I was very struck the other week in Oregon. I interviewed a policeman who happened to be black, who had spent many decades in the police, and was telling me just the roughness of what police in America have been put through in recent months. It's a very sobering story. He said something very interesting to me at one point. He said, they always talk about the duties of the police, but nobody ever talks about what the duties of the citizenry is. What if the citizens, I'm now extrapolating myself, what if the citizens oughtn't to turn out night after night and throw things at public buildings? What if the citizenry oughtn't to treat all law enforcement as some appalling group of reprehensible racists who need to be cleansed from the public square? What is the duty of the citizenry? Now, I say this because I've noticed in my life that people always wait for the perfect leader to come along, or the perfect figure. They always hope that a combination of Churchill and Roosevelt is going to emerge at the next electoral cycle. And you can hear it in the disappointment, which I shared a little bit of, that it had to be Donald Trump giving that speech in Warsaw. I can't deny that, although some of it was very much in line with things I've written, I can't deny that when I heard Donald Trump saying, "We write symphonies," I thought, Yeah. I'm not sure you do, mate. But anyway, we're never led by the perfect person, but there's something in the system that persuades us that that's where we'll somehow find redemption or victory and much more. And I'm not persuaded that that is the case. In fact, I think it's probably the worst way to do it. I think the best way to do it is for people to take it upon themselves. And I think we touched on a little of this when we spoke before in the beautiful hills above Florence, which is that the onus, if you value what we have in the West, if you value these freedoms, including the freedom of inquiry, the freedom of speech, freedom to pursue knowledge, and indeed to pursue truth, don't wait for some political leader to give you the right to speak. Don't wait for Donald Trump or Kamala Harris or Joe Biden to permit you to think. Do it yourself. Find your own way. Locate your own route through this era. Don't wait for somebody else to save you from the madness. Find a way to stay sane yourself. You know, don't be one of those people, one of those cringing people who says things, and I come across this all the time, who says things like, well, no one ever told me about that. No. Find out for yourself. And don't blame other people for your ignorance. I was never told about this. No, most people aren't ever told about anything. They find things out for themselves and they educate each other. So the great hope I think we have at the moment, and I see this all the time, is the fact that the smart younger people, what we used to call the cool kids,
Yes,
are not interested in this unpleasant, retributive, doctrinal crap that the radical left has pushed on them. The smart kids, the cool ones, I might say, are finding that it is much better to live in a realm of knowledge, which includes knowledge which is dangerous and challenging. It's much more interesting to hear a plurality of opinion than to have to chant only one through your life. My experience is that the better people, the smarter people of all backgrounds, doesn't matter whether they've got degrees or have ever been near a university, sometimes it's a lot better if they haven't, but the smarter people of every imaginable background are finding a different way through this era. They're the people who are going to save this. It's not reliant on any politician. It probably never was. It was reliant on individuals. It's the case now, just as it always has been in history. And today, the individuals in our society have a better chance than any of our ancestors did to do this with minimal violence, with minimal risk to ourselves, and with maximal potential.
Douglas Murray, author of The Strange Death of Europe, and now more recently, The Madness of Crowds. Thank you, Douglas.
It's a great pleasure.
For Uncommon Knowledge, the Hoover Institution, and Fox Nation, I'm Peter Robinson.